Okay. Literature reviews are tricky, so I thought it would be a good idea just to provide a little bit of explanation for what we're trying to do with a literature review. Um, it's a challenge to get it exactly right, and especially if we are not able to focus a lot on it in kind of a face-to-face environment. I hope that this video will help. So this is just a kind of quick Cliff Notes version of the literature review assignment. Provides a day say for your topic, organized or synthesized. We'll talk about that in a second. But the major themes that reoccur in your sources, and you're going to paraphrase and quote extensively. And it's also called an informative or explanatory synthesis sometimes. It usually comes at the beginning of a very large, kind of like research-based article. If you look at some of the sources on the scholarly databases, you'll see a lot of them have something very similar, at least, to a literature review, where they just kind of talk about what everybody else has already said about the topic. After all, there's no point in saying something that everybody else has already said. Synthesis, the best way to get a good understanding of synthesis, and one of the homework assignments that we have, are to read chapter 45 from the VU Writer's Handbook. But the kind of quick version of it is that synthesis is the idea that we organize based on the ideas when we're kind of like planning out a paper, or just trying to get our head around what's really important. We organize based on the ideas and not the sources themselves. For comparison, you guys have completed an annotated bibliography assignment. That requires a no synthesis because you're writing it out, focusing entirely on just what happens in a particular source. And so, as my simple little example up here kind of suggests, and I hope that it's clear, hopefully it will be shortly. If you're writing an annotated bibliography, you're basically writing a paragraph or a section all about the ideas in source A. So let's just say, for example, it's ideas 1 and 3 and 4. And it doesn't really matter what those are. It's just, they just represent different ideas. Okay, so a paragraph or a section about 3 different ideas, and then another source B, has a couple of ideas 2 and 4. So it has something that's kind of similar to source A, but it also has a different idea. We call it idea number 2. Sorry if that binged kind of loudly there. Source C has a couple of ideas that are similar to the other sources, but it doesn't matter. We're just focusing on that. And source D and so on and so forth has different ideas, some of which are similar. But the whole idea of writing it is that you just kind of repeat yourself, or you just kind of repeat the ideas, you summarize the ideas, you explain the ideas, whatever it is. As you can tell, if each number kind of conveys a similar or kind of very same idea, then it's going to get really, really repetitive. When a better way to organize things is to kind of group things together so that you're kind of talking about all the different sources that convey an idea in the same spot, in the same paragraph, in the same section. So you might talk about idea number 1 and then quote or paraphrase from source A, source C, source D, however many sources you have that kind of convey some aspect of that major idea, and so on and so forth. Like I said, this is a challenge for some students at first, but if you kind of get your head around doing it this way, then your papers kind of go from this really, kind of basic, rote, kind of academic writing that's just like my first source talks about yada yada yada, into something that flows and something that is more organized and something that just sounds like you are a scholar that's talking about this, which is a really good kind of like strategy to have when it comes to writing papers in college, and just when you're doing stuff, anytime you need to make an argument and incorporate different types of evidence, whatever that may be. So again, chapter 45 from the VU Writer's Handbook has better examples. Okay, let's talk about Spider-Man real quick. And yes, this is a classic picture of Spider-Man fighting all of his, bad guys. I'm going to do my best not to get too nerdy about this, but I happen to know this comes from Amazing Spider-Man 500. This is by John Romita Jr. Let's keep going. Let's say that I was going to do a synthesis of Spider-Man's greatest villains. And so I needed, and eventually I'm going to put this into kind of like a synthesis and a literature review. But first I have to do some research. And my research is very simple. I'm going to look at the first 12 issues of the 1963 Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1. Spider-Man's first ongoing comic book series. And if you could see me in person, you would see me holding up a copy of The Essential Spider-Man, a trade paperback that was published in the 90s, all in great black and white, reprinting, super cheap. It was great. This was like catnip to me when I was younger, when I was a teenager. Okay, so Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, issues 1 through 12. We see Spider-Man fight most of the villains that would become like kind of his iconic rogues gallery. But a good question that comes about, and I'm sorry it's a little cut off due to my screencast here, is what are some of the key characteristics that make up Spider-Man's greatest foes, right? We're basically trying to figure out, how do we know whether a villain is going to be iconic or whether they're going to be forgettable? And so we just have to do some research. And then you can see I eliminated some that either are not necessarily Spider-Man's greatest villains or that I felt were not necessarily like his really iconic, villains. Although I like the Enforcers. I could talk to you about Fancy Dan plenty, but I digress. Let's continue on. So let's say I'm doing an annotated bibliography. Well, here's an annotation of Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, issue number 3. Features Spider-Man's first defeat at the hands of a villain. Up until this point, he'd been doing great, but Dr. Octopus hands him his first kind of defeat. And I'll give you the chance to pause this if you'd like and read it. I'll just have you know that it's got all the parts of the annotated bibliography that I had you guys do: summary, evaluation, and justification of how the source would be useful. Now, in terms of finding themes, you kind of have to ask yourself a couple of questions. How does this source answer the research question? How do different sources answer the question similarly or differently? And then you want to kind of be connecting things together. This is where we get back to the synthesis idea. Do sources have similar points of support, refer to similar evidence? Do sources refer to similar events in the past or concerns for the future? And okay, as I'm doing my Spider-Man synthesis, a couple of things come out. One of the things that's true is that a lot of Spider-Man's villains have kind of a animal, human, hybrid sort of theme going on there, which makes a certain amount of sense. Spider-Man also kind of has that going on, right? But I'm not interpreting right now. I'm just finding themes. I'm just trying to figure out, okay, what seems to be present in the sources. And so we got a couple of different villains here. Chameleon, who's not actually a chameleon, but he is like a master of disguise, at least in the beginning. He doesn't have shape-shifting powers. He just has a lot of great costumes. Eventually, he would get shape-shifting powers. The Vulture, he has the power of flight thanks to a harness, kind of a special anti-gravity harness that's on his back. So he's not literally a vulture, but he, dresses up like one. Dr. Octopus, same idea. He has 4 mechanical arms, so they call him Dr. Octopus. And then the Lizard, he is actually a lizard man. Of course, you can see him over to the side there, being all lizardy. Another theme that comes clear when you are reading through the first 12 issues of Amazing Spider-Man is that most of Spider-Man's villains have tragic accidental origins. Also kind of interesting considering Spider-Man is also created by an accident. So Dr. Octopus, he has an explosion at the Atomic Lab, as it's called. The Sandman hid in, again, I love the way they phrase this stuff back in the 60s, the, quote, Atomic Devices Testing Center, end quote, and a nuclear bomb is being tested, right? Instead of being vaporized, he's just turned into a Sandman. Electro, he is struck by lightning while working on power lines in a, quote, 1,000,000 to 1 chance. And you got the panel from Amazing Spider-Man issue number 9 where you see that happening. Another theme that comes out about Spider-Man has to do with more how he interacts with them, in that he doesn't always beat them up. I mean, he does fight them, but that doesn't always save the day. Sometimes Spider-Man has to use his brains to solve problems. And so a couple of examples that come up here. Again, the themes always kind of have to have multiple points of support here. And you see that all of mine so far do. Amazing Spider-Man 3, Spider-Man makes an acid to fuse Doc Ock's arms together. He does it in about like 3 panels, which I equate to 5 minutes. He literally swoops down, says, "Oh, I got to whip something up," and he like dunks 2 chemicals together and says, "This should do the trick." And what do you know? It does. He's a smart guy, I guess. Spider-Man in Amazing Spider-Man number 4 vacuums up the Sandman, which is a very creative solution. You can see that panel over to the side there. That is one that amuses me to no end. We have Amazing Spider-Man number 6, where Spider-Man creates a, kind of chemical solution that, again, kind of, solving the problem with his scientific brain. He turns the lizard back to human. And Spider-Man in Amazing Spider-Man 9 uses rubber gloves to protect himself, and he uses a fire hose to short-circuit Electro. That should finish off there. So again, he's using his kind of like his brains, his scientific knowledge, just his common sense to solve problems instead of just, trying to punch the problem away, which I think is kind of a cool theme to take note of. You know, a lot of problems can't be solved with fists, and that's a good lesson for kids, and for me. Okay, and so then what you do after this is, as you kind of like figure out these kind of major themes, from there you can kind of come up with a good informative thesis. And your you know, literature review doesn't have to have a super detailed thesis, but it should have something that kind of guides it. Every piece of writing should have a main idea or a thesis statement or something like that. And so I would recommend an informative thesis just like this, where it's really, its main purpose is just to convey the most important information that needs to be known. So I just kind of wrote it like this: the major things people need to know about Spider-Man's greatest foes are that they primarily have animalistic characteristics, are the result of tragic accidents, and require Spidey's brains as well as brawn to defeat them. So animal characteristics, tragic accidents, brainy solutions. You can get the sense of how my sections are starting to develop here. And if I wanted to make it into an outline, I'm sorry, see it got cut off again there. But it would just kind of look like this, where I've got the different sections and all of my sources, all my different ideas, right? If we want to take the actual numbers and letters and stuff like that I had on that second slide and show it off here, you can kind of see it a little bit more concrete. Now, this is all well and good, but let me just kind of make a point about how it relates. How does this all relate? Well, okay, so what you have to do is you have to look in your sources for those dominant themes that appear in multiple places. This can be tricky. It takes a little bit of time. Now, if you've done your annotated bibliography right, then you can do this pretty quickly, but sometimes you have to go back to the sources. You got to find a number of dominant themes. You know, usually it's between 2 and 4 dominant themes, maybe a little bit more, depending on, you know, how many sources you have. We have, a lot of sources, 10 sources or so, but even so, I did that with Spider-Man, and I kind of came down to 3 there. List all the sources which have even just a part that can fit into that theme. Maybe it's just a sentence or two. Maybe they're providing information, and it's not the main point of the article or the source, but they still mention some perspective on that. And the best way to do this is to use a document. I've been using it for many, many years. I use it for my own projects. I use this whole process for my own projects that I have in grad school. It's called the Source Synthesis Matrix. Real quick, let me pull this up. Never done this before on a screencast, but I think we'll be able to do it without too terribly much trouble. Here we go. Okay, let me blow it up just a little bit here. Okay, that's pretty good. So here's a possible research question, and this might put it into a little bit better terms for understanding beyond Spider-Man. Spider-Man helps with a lot of things, but he doesn't fix everything. So let's just kind of say that we've got a topic about this: how effective are solar panels? Let's say I've got all these great sources right here, and I've just kind of done what I told you guys. I've listed all the kind of main points here that come about from the sources. You'll see that in doing the source matrix, just a couple of bullets for each, but you might have more. You might have less. You see, I only have 1 for some of them. And then in this column right here, I just start matching them together. Because if I can start to kind of find ideas that kind of match together with other sources, then I can kind of identify them by terms, and those are my themes. So you get this idea about affordability with solar panels. That's a major theme. You get the idea that the technology is improving. That's probably a really good theme there. And then you get this kind of like small idea here, and I think this will come up in some other notes that I provide you guys next week, about the future of solar panels, like this topic about whether or not the government's going to support the advancement of solar panels. That's a pretty important question for how effective they are. So I don't have a lot of information about that right now, but this is only 5 sources. You guys have got more sources, and you might have a lot more themes than, a lot more connections here too. But this just kind of gives you the quick rundown of how you're supposed to find themes and kind of create the synthesis that you then write up in the paper. Just write it up in paragraphs, and your paragraph should have a couple of different quotations to convey that this theme exists, or maybe even a couple of paragraphs to convey that a certain theme exists. And then you just kind of refer back to the directions to kind of help you with that too. So of course, let me know if you have any questions. Email me at mnorman@binu.edu, and good luck.